The autumn wind howled through the broken windows of the old farmhouse, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and distant smoke. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she scrubbed the wooden floor with hands that had long since lost their softness. At 20 years old, she had the weathered look of someone who had lived twice that long. Her father sat slumped in his chair near the dying fire, a bottle of cheap whiskey dangling from his fingers. The same fingers that had once taught her to read, that had braided her hair when she was small, now trembled with the constant need for drink. The farm that had once been their pride lay in ruins around them, fences broken, crops withered, animals sold off one by one to feed his addiction. Margaret. Her father's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. She looked up from her scrubbing, seeing the shame in his bloodshot eyes. We got visitors coming. She had heard the horses approaching, their hooves crunching on the gravel path that led to their door. Through the cracked window, she could see 3 men dismounting, their clothes fine and well-tailored, a stark contrast to the poverty that surrounded her daily life. The knock came sharp and demanding. Her father struggled to his feet, straightening his worn vest as if it could somehow restore his dignity. Margaret rose too, smoothing down her patched dress, though she knew no amount of smoothing could hide the holes or the stains that spoke of their desperate circumstances. When her father opened the door, the cold air rushed in along with the 3 strangers. The man in front was tall and broad, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. Behind him stood 2 younger men, brothers perhaps, both wearing expensive coats and expressions of barely concealed disgust at their surroundings. Thomas Fletcher, the older man said, not bothering with pleasantries. We need to discuss your debt. Margaret watched her father's shoulders slump even further. She had known this day would come, had seen the worry lines deepen on his face with each passing week. The gambling debts, the money borrowed to buy more whiskey, the promises made in moments of drunken optimism. It had all led to this moment. I know what I owe. Morrison, her father said, his voice barely steady. But I need more time. The harvest. There was no harvest, Morrison interrupted, stepping into their small living room without invitation. His eyes swept over the sparse furniture, the empty shelves, the cold fireplace. There hasn't been a proper harvest here for 3 years. You've drunk away everything of value. Margaret felt her heart racing as the conversation continued. She had heard whispers in town, knew that men like Morrison didn't come calling unless they intended to collect, one way or another. Her father owed money to dangerous people, money they simply didn't have. Please, her father said, and Margaret felt something break inside her chest at the desperation in his voice. Just give me another month. I can make this right. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what? This place isn't worth half of what you owe. The land is nearly worthless. Worked to death and neglected. His eyes found Margaret then, studying her with the same calculating look he had given the furniture. But perhaps we can work something out. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach as understanding dawned. She took a step backward, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. Her father looked between Morrison and his daughter, and she could see the moment when he understood as well. No, her father whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. 1 barrel of my finest whiskey, Morrison said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. Enough to last you months, Thomas. Good quality too, not the rot gut you've been drinking. And we'll call the debt even. Margaret stared at her father, willing him to refuse, to find some shred of the man he used to be. But she saw only a broken shell, a man whose addiction had consumed everything good in him. The whiskey had already taken their home, their livelihood, their future. Now it would take her too. She's my daughter, her father said weakly. She's 20 years old, Thomas. Old enough to make her own choices. And what choices does she have here? Look around you. This place will be the death of both of you. Morrison's voice was smooth, reasonable, as if he were offering salvation instead of slavery. Margaret found her voice at last. I won't go with you. Morrison turned to her with a smile that never reached his eyes. You misunderstand, girl. You don't have a choice in this matter. Your father's debts are considerable, and one way or another, they will be paid. The room fell silent except for the wind outside and the crackling of the dying fire. Margaret looked at her father, searching his face for any sign that he would fight for her, protect her as a father should. Instead, she saw only the hunger in his eyes as he stared at Morrison's men, who had produced a bottle of amber liquid that caught the firelight like liquid gold. Just until I can pay you back, her father said. his voice breaking. "Just alone. You understand. She'll come back." Morrison's laughter filled the room. "Of course, Thomas. Just alone." But Margaret knew better. She had seen what happened to girls who disappeared with men like Morrison. Some were never seen again. Others returned months or years later, broken in ways that never fully healed. And her father, lost in his addiction, was willing to trade her away for a bottle of whiskey. The next few minutes passed in a blur of harsh voices and rough hands. Margaret tried to run, but Morrison's men were faster and stronger. Her father sat in his chair, clutching the bottle they had given him, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes as they dragged her toward the door. "Please," she begged, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The world outside was dark and cold, and the carriage that waited for her looked like a prison on wheels. As they forced her inside, Margaret caught one last glimpse of her father through the farmhouse window. He had already opened the bottle and was lifting it to his lips with shaking hands. In that moment, she realized that the man who had raised her, who had sung her lullabies and taught her to be strong, was truly dead. What remained was just a shell, animated by nothing but the need for drink. The carriage lurched into motion, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. Through the small window, she watched the lights of her childhood home grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely into the darkness. She was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but uncertainty ahead of her. Morrison sat across from her in the carriage, his face hidden in shadow. "Don't look so frightened, girl. You might find your new life more agreeable than the one you're leaving behind." But Margaret knew that whatever lay ahead could be no worse than the betrayal she had just experienced. Her own father had sold her for a bottle of whiskey, valuing his addiction more than his daughter's life and safety. The knowledge cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving her hollow and numb. As the carriage rolled through the night toward an unknown destination, Margaret made a silent vow. She would survive whatever came next. She would endure, and somehow, someday, she would find a way to reclaim her life and her freedom. The girl who had scrubbed floors and tended to a broken man was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who understood that in this world, she could rely on no one but herself. The wheels of the carriage continued to turn, carrying her deeper into the darkness, while behind them, in a crumbling farmhouse, a man drank himself into oblivion, trying to forget the price he had paid for his next bottle. The mansion stood like a monument to wealth and cruelty, its tall windows glowing with warm light that seemed to mock Margaret's despair. 3 months had passed since the night her father had traded her away. 3 months of living in a beautiful prison where she learned that luxury could be its own form of torture. Margaret's room was elegant by any measure, with silk curtains and a feather bed that would have seemed like paradise to the girl who had once slept on a straw mattress. But the windows were barred, the door locked from the outside, and the servants who brought her meals refused to meet her eyes. She was a possession now, something to be displayed and used at Morrison's whim. The other girls had tried to warn her in whispers stolen during the brief moments when they were allowed to walk in the garden under watchful eyes. Sarah, barely 18, had been there for 2 years, taken from her family when they couldn't pay the rent on their shop. Elena, once a teacher, had arrived 6 months ago when her brother's gambling debts had spiraled beyond control. Their stories were all variations of the same theme. Families destroyed by desperation, daughters sacrificed to pay for the mistakes of men. Morrison's house parties were the worst part. Wealthy men would arrive in fine carriages, and the girls would be brought down like ornaments, dressed in expensive gowns and expected to smile and charm guests who saw them as nothing more than entertainment. Margaret had learned to hide her hatred behind a mask of compliance, knowing that defiance only brought punishment. Tonight was different, though she couldn't yet understand why. The usual preparations were underway. Baths drawn, gowns selected, hair styled by servants who worked in silence, but there was tension in the air. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room, meaningful looks exchanged between the staff. As Margaret was led downstairs to the main parlor, she noticed fewer guests than usual. Only 5 men sat around Morrison's table, their voices low and serious. Among them was a face she didn't recognize. A man perhaps 10 years older than herself, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this house of shadows. "Ah, gentlemen, allow me to present Margaret," Morrison announced as she was brought forward. 20 years old, well-educated, and completely untouched by the corruptions of city life. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame as the men's eyes appraised her. She had learned to endure these moments by retreating inside herself. imagining she was somewhere else. Someone else. But the stranger's gaze was different. Where the others looked at her with hunger or calculation, he seemed to see her pain. The evening progressed like many others, with too much wine and too much laughter that held no joy. Margaret served drinks and smiled when spoken to, playing the part Morrison demanded while counting the minutes until she could return to her room. But she found herself stealing glances at the stranger, trying to understand why his presence felt different. His name was James. She learned from overheard conversations. He was new money, having made his fortune in railroad investments, and tonight marked his first invitation to one of Morrison's exclusive gatherings. The other men treated him with the careful courtesy reserved for those whose wealth was useful but whose breeding was questionable. "Tell me about the girl," James said quietly to Morrison during a lull in conversation. Margaret was pouring wine across the room, but her trained ears caught every word. "Beautiful, isn't she? Pure as fresh snow, too. Her father owed me a considerable sum, and she was the only thing of value he had left to offer." Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of a man describing a particularly good business deal. "And she has no choice in the matter?" Morrison laughed. "Choice? My dear fellow, choice is a luxury for those who can afford it. The girl has a roof over her head, fine clothes, good food. Many women would consider themselves fortunate." Margaret watched James's jaw tighten, saw something flash in his eyes that might have been anger. Throughout the rest of the evening, she noticed him watching her, and gradually she began to understand that his presence here was no accident. As the night wore on, the other guests grew louder and more careless with drink. Margaret had learned to recognize the signs, knew that soon Morrison would begin his usual routine of showing off his collection. The thought made her stomach turn, but she had no choice but to endure whatever came next. But before Morrison could begin his display, James rose from his chair. "I'm afraid I must take my leave, gentlemen. Early morning ahead of me." "Surely you can stay a bit longer," Morrison said, his tone holding a hint of pressure. "The evening is just beginning to become interesting. I appreciate the hospitality, but business calls." James moved toward the door, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. "Actually, Morrison, I wonder if we might discuss a private matter before I go." Margaret watched as the two men stepped into Morrison's study, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The remaining guests continued their drinking and crude conversation, but she found herself straining to hear what was being discussed in the next room. 20 minutes later, James emerged alone. Morrison followed, his face flushed and his manner suddenly cordial in a way that seemed forced. Of course, Morrison was saying. "A pleasure doing business with you, my friend." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen Morrison make deals before, had watched as lives were bought and sold in this very room, but she couldn't understand what James might want that Morrison could provide. As James prepared to leave, he approached her where she stood clearing glasses from a side table. The other men were too drunk to pay much attention, and Morrison had stepped away to speak with a servant. "Margaret," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, startled to hear her name spoken with such gentleness in this house where she was rarely acknowledged as more than an object. "I know this will be hard to believe," he continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "but I'm here to help you. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, watch for my signal from the garden. A lantern." Swung 3 times. Margaret stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Was this another trap, another cruel game? In this place, hope had become more dangerous than despair. "Why?" she managed to whisper. James's eyes held a sadness that seemed to echo her own. "Because no one should be traded like property. Because everyone deserves a choice." Before she could respond, Morrison returned, and James stepped away with a casual nod. Within minutes, he was gone, leaving Margaret to wonder if the conversation had been real or just another dream born of desperation. That night, alone in her locked room, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. Could she trust this stranger? What if it was a test, a way for Morrison to identify which girls might be planning escape? The punishment for such attempts was severe. She had seen what happened to Elena when she tried to climb the garden wall, but as the hours passed, she found herself thinking about James's words. Everyone deserves a choice. In this house, she had forgotten that choices existed at all. Her life had become a series of commands to follow, rules to obey, punishments to endure. The idea that she might have some control over her destiny seemed impossible. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret went through her usual routines. The careful styling of her hair, the selection of appropriate clothing, the practiced smile that hid her true feelings. But beneath the surface, her mind was racing. If James was telling the truth, if escape was possible, she would need to be ready. As evening approached, her nervousness grew. Morrison noticed her distraction during dinner, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You seem unusually agitated tonight, my dear," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "I'm sorry, sir. Just a headache," Margaret replied, lowering her eyes submissively. Morrison studied her for a long moment before turning his attention elsewhere. But Margaret could feel his gaze returning to her throughout the evening, and she forced herself to appear calm despite the storm of emotions inside her. When the guests finally departed and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Margaret positioned herself by her window. The garden below was shrouded in darkness, the new moon providing no light to reveal what might be hiding in the shadows. Hours passed. Margaret began to think she had imagined the entire conversation, that her desperate hope had created words that were never spoken. But then, just as she was about to turn away from the window, she saw it, a small light moving among the trees, swinging back and forth 3 times before disappearing. Her heart pounded as she made her decision. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than the life she was living. With trembling hands, she gathered the few possessions that truly mattered to her. A locket that had belonged to her mother, a book of poems her father had given her before the drinking took hold of him completely. The window opened silently, thanks to weeks of careful preparation with a small knife she had stolen from the kitchen. The bars had been loosened gradually, a little each night, and now they swung aside just enough for her to squeeze through. The drop to the garden below was further than it looked from inside, and Margaret landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle. But she forced herself to stand, to move toward the shadows where she had seen the light. "Margaret." The voice came from the darkness beneath an old oak tree, and James stepped into view, no longer the well-dressed gentleman from Morrison's parlor but a man in simple traveling clothes, a horse waiting behind him. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said, extending his hand to help her. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before taking it. "I don't understand why you're doing this." James helped her onto the horse behind him, then mounted himself. "Sometimes understanding comes later. Right now, we need to put distance between ourselves and this place." As they rode away into the night, Margaret looked back only once at the mansion that had been her prison. In one of the upper windows, she thought she saw a figure watching their departure. But whether it was Morrison or one of the other girls, she couldn't tell. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in months, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Whatever James's reasons for helping her, whatever price this freedom might eventually cost, she was no longer trapped in a beautiful cage, no longer a possession to be displayed and used at another's whim. Behind them, the lights of Morrison's house faded into the distance until they were nothing more than a memory of darkness that she prayed she would never have to face again. The small cottage sat nestled in a valley far from any main road, surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Morrison's mansion, 3 weeks of traveling by night and hiding by day, always looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Margaret sat by the window, watching James tend to the small garden behind the house. He had been patient with her silence, understanding that trust would not come easily to someone who had been betrayed by everyone she had ever loved. In the quiet moments between dawn and sunrise, when the world felt safe and still, she found herself beginning to believe that this peace might be real. The cottage belonged to James's sister, Rachel, a widow who lived alone with her young daughter after her husband's death in a mining accident. Rachel had welcomed Margaret without questions, seeing something in her eyes that spoke of shared pain and loss. In this house, Margaret was not a possession or a burden, but simply a woman in need of sanctuary. "She's been through hell," Rachel had told her brother quietly one evening when Margaret was asleep. "I can see it in the way she jumps at sudden noises, how she won't eat until everyone else has finished. What did they do to her in that place?" James had explained only what was necessary, but Rachel understood enough. She had made it her mission to help Margaret remember what it felt like to be safe, to be valued for more than her usefulness to others. Slowly, gradually, Margaret began to emerge from the shell of fear and mistrust that had protected her during those dark months. It was Rachel who first encouraged Margaret to speak about her past. Not the recent horrors, but the good memories from before everything fell apart. Margaret found herself telling stories of her mother, who had died when she was 12, and of her father before the drinking consumed him. She spoke of books she had read, dreams she had harbored of perhaps becoming a teacher herself someday. Those dreams don't have to die just because you've been through darkness, Rachel said gently. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in soil that has been through fire. James remained a mystery to Margaret, though. She knew he had wealth. The money he had paid Morrison for her freedom had been substantial, enough to ensure that no pursuit would follow them. But she didn't understand why a successful businessman would risk everything to save a stranger. The answer came on a rainy afternoon when Margaret discovered James in the cottage's small library, staring at a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. The resemblance between the woman in the painting and Margaret herself was unmistakable. Her name was Anne, James said without turning around, somehow sensing Margaret's presence in the doorway. She would have been about your age now. Margaret moved closer, studying the portrait. The woman's face held a sadness that seemed familiar, a resignation that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. What happened to her? James was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. Her father owed money to the wrong people. When he couldn't pay, they took her instead. I tried to find her, tried to buy her freedom, but I was young then, without the resources I have now. By the time I had enough money to make a difference, it was too late. The pieces began to fall into place in Margaret's mind. She was your wife. She was going to be. We were planning to marry in the spring, start a new life together away from the city. But winter came early that year, and with it, men who saw her as nothing more than a way to settle a debt. James finally turned to face Margaret, and she saw in his eyes a grief that time had not diminished. I found her 3 months later, in a house much like the one I found you in. But she was already broken, her spirit crushed by things I can't bear to imagine. She died that winter, just gave up and let go of life. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, understanding now the weight of responsibility James must feel. He was trying to save her, not just for her own sake, but for Anne's as well, attempting to give one woman the rescue he had been unable to provide for another. You don't have to carry that guilt, Margaret said softly. What happened to her wasn't your fault. Perhaps not, James replied. But what happens to you now is my responsibility. I won't let you become another Anne, another life lost to the cruelty of desperate men. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about the weight of survival, how one person's tragedy could become another's salvation. James had saved her not just from Morrison's house, but from the despair that might have consumed her as it had consumed Anne. In return, perhaps her survival could offer him some measure of peace. Summer arrived with gentle warmth and the promise of new beginnings. Margaret had begun helping Rachel with her small business of taking in sewing and mending, discovering that she had a talent for delicate work that brought in welcome income. More importantly, she had begun to remember who she was beyond the fear and trauma that had defined her recent existence. It was during these quiet weeks that Margaret noticed a change in James. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes began to fade, replaced by something that might have been contentment. He spent less time staring at Anne's portrait and more time working in the garden, building shelves for Rachel's books, playing simple games with her daughter. He's healing too, Rachel observed one evening as they watched James teach little Mary to whittle a small wooden horse. Saving you gave him purpose again, but seeing you thrive is giving him hope. Margaret understood. In helping her rebuild her life, James was learning to rebuild his own. The guilt and grief that had driven him for so long were slowly being replaced by the satisfaction of seeing genuine good come from his actions. But their peaceful existence was not destined to last undisturbed. Word eventually reached them that Morrison had been asking questions, hiring men to search for his missing property. The network of wealth and corruption that had sustained his business was vast, and he had resources that even James's money might not be able to counter indefinitely. We need to leave, James announced one morning after receiving a letter that had come by special messenger. Morrison's men were asking questions in the village yesterday. It's only a matter of time before they find this place. Margaret felt the familiar cold fear creep up her spine. She had been foolish to think that escape could be so simple, that freedom was something that could be claimed and then kept without constant vigilance. But this time, she was not alone in her fear. Rachel immediately began making preparations, packing supplies and making arrangements with neighbors to watch over her home. We'll go west, she said decisively. I have a cousin in California who's been asking me to visit for years. It's time I took her up on that invitation. You don't have to come with us, Margaret protested. This isn't your fight. Rachel's smile was firm. Child, you've become family. And family doesn't abandon each other when danger comes calling. As they prepared to leave, James pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. They walked to a small hill overlooking the valley that had sheltered them for these precious months. The cottage below, looking like a painting in the evening light. I need you to understand something, James said, his voice serious. Where we're going, things will be different. We'll be starting completely over, with new names, new histories. The life you've known, even the good parts, will have to be left behind. Margaret nodded, though the thought of erasing her entire past filled her with sadness. I understand. But James, I need to ask you something. When we get to California, when we're safely away from Morrison and his reach, what happens then? What happens to us? James was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the hills where they had found such unexpected peace. I suppose that depends on what you want to happen. I can give you money to start your own life, help you become truly independent. You could pursue those dreams of teaching that you told Rachel about. You could build whatever kind of future you choose. And if I wanted you to be part of that future? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Margaret had not meant to voice her growing feelings for the man who had saved her, but the words had escaped before she could stop them. James turned to look at her, surprise and something deeper flickering in his eyes. Margaret, you've been through trauma that I can't fully understand. What you feel now, what you think you feel for me, might just be gratitude or the need for security. I won't take advantage of that. You think I don't know my own mind? I think you deserve time to discover who you are when you're truly free, when you're not running or hiding or depending on anyone else for survival. If, after that discovery, you still feel something real for me, then we can talk about what the future might hold. Margaret appreciated his caution, even as part of her longed for him to simply take her in his arms and promise that they would face whatever came next together. But she understood his wisdom. She needed to learn who she was when she was not defined by fear, or desperation, or even gratitude. The next morning, they set out for California, traveling now as a small family unit. James and Rachel as brother and sister, Margaret as Rachel's cousin, little Mary as the niece they were all devoted to protecting. The story was simple and believable, the kind of ordinary family migration that would attract no special attention from those who might be watching for a wealthy man traveling with a young woman. The journey west took weeks, and with each mile they put between themselves and their old lives, Margaret felt something inside her beginning to unfold. The constant vigilance began to ease, replaced by curiosity about the vast landscape they were crossing and excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. In the evenings around their campfire, she found herself laughing at James's stories and contributing her own tales to their conversations. She began to see him not just as her rescuer but as a man with his own hopes and fears, his own dreams for what the future might bring. California, when they finally reached it, was everything the stories had promised and more. The small town where Rachel's cousin lived was full of people starting over, building new lives far from whatever circumstances had driven them west. Here, Margaret's past was truly her own, something she could choose to share or keep private as she saw fit. She found work as a teacher in the town's small school, fulfilling the dream she had shared with Rachel all those months ago. James invested in a small ranch outside of town, raising horses and gradually building a reputation as a fair and honest businessman. Rachel opened a dress shop that quickly became the gathering place for the town's women, her warm personality and skillful needlework making her an instant favorite. Months passed, then years. Margaret grew into her independence, becoming known throughout the community as a dedicated teacher and a woman of quiet strength. She formed friendships with other women, participated in town committees, built a life that was entirely her own creation. And through it all, James remained a constant presence, neither pushing for more than friendship nor withdrawing from her life entirely. They would share dinners at Rachel's house, attend town social events together, take long walks discussing books and ideas and dreams for the future. It was during one of those walks, on a warm evening 3 years after their arrival in California, that Margaret finally spoke the words that had been building in her heart for months. I know who I am now, she said simply. I know what I want. James stopped walking, turning to face her in the fading light. And what is that? I want a life with you. Not because you saved me, not because I'm grateful or afraid or dependent, but because I love you, because in all my independence and strength, the thing that would make me happiest would be to share it with you. James's smile was gentle, full of the same hope she felt rising in her own chest. Are you absolutely certain? Because once we take this step, once we build a life together, I won't let anything or anyone take you away from me again. Margaret reached for his hands, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentle strength that had guided her through her darkest hours. I'm certain I choose you, James, not because I have to, but because I want to. When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who understood the preciousness of what he was receiving, and Margaret kissed him back with the confidence of a woman who had fought for her freedom and could now freely choose to share it. Later, much later, as they sat on the porch of the small house James had built with his own hands, Margaret reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been traded away for a barrel of whiskey, treated as property, robbed of her dignity and her choices, but she had survived, endured, and ultimately triumphed. What are you thinking about? James asked, following her gaze out over the peaceful valley that had become their home. I was thinking about choices, Margaret said. How someone tried to take mine away, and how you gave them back to me. James squeezed her hand gently. You gave them back to yourself. I just reminded you that they existed. Margaret smiled, thinking of the woman she had been in that crumbling farmhouse so many years ago, scrubbing floors and dreaming of something better. That woman could never have imagined this life, this love, this sense of belonging and purpose. Come with me, she whispered. The same words James had spoken to her on that terrible night when he had offered her hope in the darkness. But this time, they were words of invitation to a future they would build together. A promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as equals, as partners, as two people who had chosen each other freely and completely. The stars appeared one by one in the California sky, each one a reminder that even in the darkest night, light could be found by those who had the courage to keep looking for it. And in the small house where a teacher and a rancher were planning their wedding, two hearts that had known the depths of despair were learning that love freely given was worth every battle they had fought to find it.